phrase "by their fruits" comes from the Bible, specifically in Matthew chapter 7 in the Sermon on the Mount, wherein we read the following. "Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them." This passage is often interpreted to mean that someone's character or actions, their fruits, reveal the true nature of their heart. It's a simple call for discernment in others. Now, it needs to be pointed out that this entire argument is a logical fallacy. It's an argumentium ad consequentium, also known as the appeal to consequence. It's a logical fallacy where someone argues that a belief is true or false based on the consequences of accepting it, rather than on the evidence supporting the belief itself. But with all that being said, let's imagine for a moment that the "by their fruits ye shall know them" principle is a valid way to discern truth. Then an argument can be made that the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was the true Mormon sect in the early days following Joseph Smith's death. The RLDS Church under Joseph Smith III rejected polygamy outright, while Brigham Young enshrined it as core doctrine and necessary for salvation. This led to immense suffering, forced marriages, and the misery of countless women's lives. The Community of Christ never instituted racial restrictions for priesthood ordination. The priesthood ban under Brigham Young was doctrinally justified using ideas about the curse of Cain and the curse of Ham. This prevented black people in the Brighamite branch from entering the temple and holding the priesthood. If divine truth is really revealed by the fruits of a doctrine, then the racial inclusivity of the Community of Christ wins by a large margin. Brigham Young championed the so-called blood atonement doctrine. He preached that some sins were so severe that Christ's atonement was insufficient, and therefore the sinner needed to shed their own blood to make atonement. This horrific doctrine may have contributed to many violent events, including the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Young also taught that Adam was God the Father, a belief that was later denounced by subsequent Mormon prophets. And Young established an authoritarian theocracy in Utah with strict control over both church and state affairs, leading to conflict with the United States government. The Community of Christ avoided all of these radical teachings, keeping its theology more aligned with Christianity and distancing itself from violent and authoritarian practices. The Community of Christ has always maintained a council-based leadership with a more open and democratic decision-making process. The Brighamite branch, in contrast, has evolved to an ever more top-heavy organization, with Brigham Young exercising near total control over doctrine, policy, and members' lives. The Community of Christ has never engaged in organized violence or military aggression. The LDS Church under Brigham Young did. For instance, in the Utah War in 1857, Brigham Young declared martial law, leading to skirmishes with the U.S. Army. And let's not forget the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857. During that fateful September day, LDS leaders in Utah orchestrated the slaughter of over 120 individuals. And let's not forget the Black Hawk War, which was maybe the longest and most destructive conflict between pioneer immigrants and Native Americans in Utah history. If by their fruits includes nonviolence and peace, the Community of Christ clearly followed a more Christian path, rather than Brigham Young's militant theocracy. The Community of Christ has never implemented the extreme financial demands of the Brighamite branch. For instance, the LDS Church requires the payment of tithing for a temple recommend and therefore the ordinances of salvation. It has repeatedly encouraged its members to make huge financial sacrifices, even if it meant going without basic necessities or feeding their own children. The Mormon Church has built up over a $200 billion illegal clandestine hedge fund, at the same time that some members are struggling financially. The Community of Christ has never made salvation contingent upon financial donation, which is quite frankly a more ethical and Christ-like approach. The Community of Christ is far more progressive on gender roles than the LDS Church was under Brigham Young. Brigham Young taught that women were to be eternally subjugated to men, And let's not forget that polygamy is fundamentally a form of control over women, forcing them into marriages that they didn't consent to. And there's also the extreme modesty expectations and purity culture that is inherent in a patriarchal leadership structure. In contrast, the RLDS Church never subjugated women to polygamy, and it's always treated women more fairly. It later even ordained women to the priesthood, and the current president of the church is a woman. These are all steps towards gender equality that the LDS Church hasn't even begun. Both of these religions accept the Book of Mormon as scripture, but the RLDS Church did not use it to justify racist policies, polygamy, or extreme doctrines. Brighamite Mormonism often reinterpreted the Book of Mormon to justify its practices. For instance, the justification of polygamy, even though Jacob chapter 2 seems to condemn it. And in 2 Nephi chapter 26, even though the Book of Mormon teaches that God is no respecter of persons, the Brighamite branch reinterpreted that to justify the race and the priesthood ban. The RLDS has always emphasized Jesus Christ in Scripture over charismatic leaders. On the other hand, Latter-day Saints under Brigham Young elevated prophets to a near infallible status. The Mormon Church has developed a culture of obedience, where questioning leaders is seen as deeply sinful. And modern Mormonism includes extreme loyalty tests, such as publicly sustaining leaders in every meeting. By contrast, the RLDS Church allowed for more theological debate, questioning, and change, leading to a healthier and more open religious environment. The RLDS Church never canonized the Book of Abraham, while the LDS Church embraced it as sacred scripture. The Book of Abraham was later proven by Egyptologists to be a mistranslation of an ordinary Egyptian funerary text, the Book of Breathings. But Brighamite Mormonism continues to uphold the Book of Abraham as sacred scripture, despite overwhelming evidence that it's not what Joseph Smith claimed it to be. And the Book of Abraham was used to justify the race and the priesthood ban, reinforcing a disgusting doctrine of racial superiority for whites. By rejecting the Book of Abraham, the RLDS Church was able to accomplish the following: avoided false scripture that was based on a mistranslation, did not tie itself to racial teachings, and stuck closer to verifiable historical authenticity. In contrast to what Brigham Young and later LDS Church historians did, the RLDS Church never engaged in historical cover-ups, whereas the Brighamite branch whitewashed its history, downplaying or altering controversial events like polygamy, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, or changes in doctrine. The LDS Church also has restricted access to its key documents, including early versions of Joseph Smith's first vision accounts and records related to the origins of polygamy. The Brighamite branch has promoted a sanitized narrative, making it difficult for faithful members to access reliable historical information. And the LDS Church has only recently acknowledged difficult issues. For example, race, polygamy, and the Book of Abraham through its Gospel Topics essays, which were buried on the church's website and never fully publicized. And this is all in huge contrast to the RLDS Church, which allowed for an honest historical inquiry without punishing or silencing its members. It never hid inconvenient facts about Joseph Smith or early church events. It's maintained a more open and evolving stance towards church history. And even though the entire argument of "by their fruits you shall know them" is a logical fallacy, if we were to take the couplet seriously, as a way to discriminate between truth and error, then historical honesty and transparency are a sign of good fruits.
When it comes to nicknames of the church, such as LDS Church, the Mormon Church, to remove the Lord's name from the Lord's church is a major victory for Satan.
Satan.